My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas. Are we still wishing people a Happy New Year?
We can.
Well, let's. Happy New Year, everybody.
Happy New Year, everybody. It is January the 6th. So we're 6 days in, but we're still happy that it's a new year. It's better than 2021, right?
Absolutely. We've got snow on the way up here in Connecticut, which we've had very little of so far this winter.
And maybe some here. We're not sure. We are just 2 days removed from the icy hellscape that I-95 became during the most recent storm. So we've still got some interesting stories coming out of there.
I just pray that you don't get hundreds, if not thousands, of cars trapped on I-95 again. That was not good.
Yeah.
I'm actually amazed. I don't think there were any fatalities in that situation. What a mess.
No, but there was a very good story that came out this morning about the Schmidt Baking Company, whose CEO got on the phone with some stranded motorists and said, "You guys are trapped on 95. Have my driver open the door, distribute that bread."
You're kidding.
No, I'm not kidding. Yeah, so they distributed bread to as many cars as they could get to along the stretch of 95. So if you are interested in showing your support with your dollars, everybody go buy something from the Schmidt Baking Company, available at like Harris Teeter and Kroger and all of that, because they fed, stranded motorists on 95 during this great big storm.
Yeah, in a situation like that, I know it can be very difficult. I remember seeing pictures from Senator Kane's car, just locked in between all of these semi-trailers, and you've got nowhere to go. And then they tell you don't abandon your car, because the hope is that at some point the road will be cleared, and they obviously want to move your car out of the way. So they want you to stay with your car. But when it gets to be hour after hour, and particularly people that might have health issues or might be traveling with children, animals, the whole thing, you have to feel like, what do I do here?
Yeah. Yeah, it has definitely made me realize that it is probably a good idea to have emergency supplies in your car at all times, including like emergency granola bars or something like that.
Right. There's another feel-good story that I hope will come to fruition now, which, remember, 95, of course, runs all the way from Maine to Florida and vice versa. They mentioned a family from Connecticut up this way who were coming back from a vacation in Florida, ended up trapped on the highway in Virginia, and then they were distributing oranges that they were bringing back from Florida to their home up here in New England. And at the time I last read the story, which would have been this morning, they were trying to identify who the family was.
Okay.
Hopefully they'll figure that out. This is somebody that had a crate of oranges and was heading back to the frozen Northeast.
And they gave out their oranges. It was nice of them.
Yeah, I thought that was very nice. I'm thrilled that there were no fatalities. Sometimes in situations like this, you end up with terrible stories about people passing away from medical emergencies and that sort of thing. Just what a mess.
Here's hoping it isn't. Again, I did notice on my way home from school today, even though we are not expected to have snow here, we're expected to get rain. They had gone out and pre-treated the roads just in case.
Yeah, we had a situation here the other day where there was terrible icing, just not a thick layer or anything, but enough to create complete havoc on the roads. Accidents all over the place. Every major highway had serious accidents. There was a lot of question about why weren't we pre-treating the roads? Today, the meteorologists were responding. Conditions actually didn't lend themselves to pre-treating, and it just kind of went one of those situations where it's raining, and it's like in the mid-30s, and then the temperature just dips in enough so there's like a flash freeze, and it's a mess.
For those of you guys not in the U.S., sorry to bore you with United States weather, but And we've got Australian listeners, and it's like, it's probably pretty hot down there.
Right now, they're enjoying their
You
summer.
guys are in the middle of summer.
Yeah, they're thinking, what are these people talking about?
We're in the frozen wastes.
Well, we don't mean to move past this time of year without thanking everybody for all of their support and wishing everybody a happy new year and thanking you for your listening and enjoyment, we hope, of.
Yeah, we're approaching our second birthday here.
We are actually right about now. We got to figure that out.
January 11th, I think it is our second birthday.
Okay.
So we're
ask the teacher. So by the time this episode airs in a few days, we'll have crossed over the threshold of 2 years.
Yeah, that's crazy. Thank you to everybody who has continued listening and putting up with us and asked questions and bought merch and have continued to be steadfast, loyal listeners. Thank you all so much. Here's to 2 years and more.
Mm-hmm. So on that upbeat note, we have a pretty serious case that we want to talk about today.
Yes, we wanted to continue with our theme of exonerations. And so we talked last episode about Anthony Broadwater's exoneration in the rape of Alice Sebald from 1981. We wanted to cover another notable exoneration. There were 3 big ones that happened all within like the same week in November. We weren't able to cover them at that point because we had other cases that were on the docket for us. But I didn't want too much more time to pass by without acknowledging these very important exonerations. We covered one, Mr. Broadwater for Miss Sebald, and today we're going to cover the Groveland Four. The Groveland Four is a case that stretches back to 1949 in Groveland, Florida. And this is an exoneration that I think you'll agree with me, Bill. This was long overdue.
Oh, I think so. And it's a case I was not familiar with until you put it on my radar and, highlighted the fact that this case had recently had significant developments. Groveland, for everyone's benefit, is 30 miles west of Orlando. So this puts you kind of moving more into the center part of the state. This is a long time ago. This is 1949 and really a different era on so many levels.
Very much so. We're talking about Jim Crow South. And so on July 16th, 1949, Norma Paget, 17, a white female, was traveling home from a dance with her, it says, estranged husband in the reporting. We don't have a ton of information about the husband or why they were estranged, but she was returning home with her husband when their car broke down on the side of the road. She stated that 4 men by the name of Ernest Thomas, Samuel Shepard, Charles Greenlee, and Walter Irvin pulled alongside to help. And when they got out of the car, they attacked her husband and then pulled her from the car and raped her, all of which is bad enough. But right after the crime happened, there were actually a lot of doubt as to whether or not Paget had actually been raped. As a matter of fact, the doctor who examined her said he could not be certain that she had been. There were no physical findings on her that indicated a physical attack. He could not find any sperm or other bodily fluids on her, and that would go on to be a key piece of evidence a little bit later. We'll get into that. There was some question from the very beginning about whether or not Norma Paget had actually been attacked, as she said. These 4 men, Mr. Thomas, Mr. Shepard, Mr. Greenlee, and Mr. Irvin, were arrested for this crime.
It should be noted at this point, just in case it isn't completely obvious, Norma Paget is white. The 4 gentlemen in question are all young black men between the ages of 16 and 26.
Yes. What happened as a result of that accusation of rape, I think, is probably, it's not an exaggeration to call it absolutely atrocious. A number of things happened as a result of this in fairly short order. So I'll go person by person to kind of tell their story. First of all, you have Ernest Thomas, the first man who was accused. He attempted to flee from Lake County into the Florida Panhandle. He was chased down by an angry mob of 1,000 men led by the sheriff of Lake County, Willis McCall. The mob caught up to him and shot him more than 400 times, killing him.
This is essentially a lynch mob.
Yes. I don't think there's a better way to describe it.
And Willis McCall is a notorious white supremacist and racist. And I know you want to get into more detail on that in a minute.
The other three men in question, let me talk about Mr. Greenlee first. Charles Greenlee was the youngest of the men accused. He was 16 at the time, and he ultimately was convicted as other three men. But due to his age, he was not sentenced to death. In fact, he was given the mercy sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Later on, his sentence was commuted to life with the possibility of parole by a later governor of the state, Thomas Collins, who actually doubted the evidence that was presented at trial against some of these men. So we'll get into that evidence in just a couple of minutes. Then you've had the other two key players here, Walter Irvin and Samuel Shepard. Both of these men were World War II veterans. They both received death sentences as a result of their involvement or their alleged involvement with this crime. There is a whole secondary story, though, to Walter Irvin and Samuel Shepard. Essentially, at this point, you have three young Black men who are brought to trial for a rape that very likely did not happen. And according to the evidence set out, it looks like the sheriff and the judge and the prosecutor knew that no rape had taken place. There are accusations later on of fabricated evidence of a sheriff's deputy who crafted evidence out of whole cloth and then presented it to the jury. There is just every kind of malfeasance that you could possibly imagine that happened during this case and during this trial for these young men. It is just infuriating. Walter Irvin and Samuel Shepard did ultimately decide to appeal their convictions. So in 1951, they decided to appeal their conviction, and they actually sought out the help of a couple of different people. Two of them were Harry Moore and Harriet Moore, married couple. They were teachers who founded the NAACP. They founded the NAACP in 1934, and they agreed to help Irvin and Shepard with their case. With their help and the help of a lawyer, the U.S. Supreme Court actually did overturn their conviction because according to the Supreme Court, they said there was no evidence to convict you. We don't see sufficient evidence, and so we are going to overturn your verdicts. And they were granted a second trial with the hope that a jury would see reason and understand there was no evidence to convict these gentlemen in the first place. So the men were on their way to a pre-trial hearing for their second trial when the unthinkable occurred. When I read this, I had to go back and read a couple of times to make sure that I had really understood what had happened here. On their way to their pre-trial hearing, the men were on their way to their pretrial hearing for their second trial when they were shot by Lake County Sheriff Willis McCall, who, as you mentioned before, Bill, was a white supremacist, segregationist, overall bad dude. He alleged at the time that both men were trying to escape. A little hard to escape when you're both in handcuffs. He forgot to mention that part, but he did allege that both men were trying to escape, and so he shot them. Unfortunately for Sheriff Willis McCall, Mr. Irvin did survive, and he later testified that, no, we weren't trying to escape. We weren't trying to escape at all. In fact, he said that he heard Sheriff McCall bragging on the radio moments before he shot both men that he had got rid of Irvin and Shepard.
Other people involved in the case also met tragic ends. Harry and Harriet Moore, the teachers that we mentioned who had assisted in their defense, the Moore's house was bombed on Christmas Day, 1951. As a result of their work on the case, Harry died before reaching the hospital, and Harriet died 9 days later. So this married couple who had helped found the NAACP were also murdered as a result of their assistance and involvement in this case.
This is just the nastiest example of the deepest, deep South that you can imagine. You've got lynch mobs, you've got bombings, you've got people in power shooting people in their custody. It's awful. The more that I read about this, the more that I wondered why I had never heard of this case before.
Me too. I felt the same way. We were doing some additional research. Sheriff McCall, by the way, was reelected 7 times between 1949 and 1972. He only lost an election after he was involved in yet another murder of a suspect in custody, and he killed that man, and apparently that was finally too much for the people of Lake County, Florida, and he was defeated.
Absolutely unreal. So you have, at this point, 2 of the people allegedly involved in this crime who have died. The first has died as the result of a lynch mob. The second has died as the result of a shooting by a crooked sheriff, leaving Greenlee. And Irvin went to trial again in 1952. And this time he was represented by a name that is going to be familiar to most of our listeners, and that is the NAACP official who would later go on to serve on the United States Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall. Despite having that truly excellent legal counsel on his side, Irvin was convicted by an all-white jury and was sentenced to death for a second time. Irvin's sentence was commuted to life in prison with the possibility of parole a little ways down the road by a governor by the name of Thomas Leroy Collins. Collins had some real doubt about the evidence against Irvin. He did not feel comfortable putting a man to death for a crime that Collins seemed fairly sure he had not committed. He did ultimately commute that sentence to life in prison. And so eventually Irvin was granted parole in 1968. Unfortunately, he only had a little bit of time to live as a free man before dying in 1969. By 1969, there was only one surviving member of the group of 4 men who would go on to be called the Groveland Four, and that was Charles Greenlee, the one who was 16 years old at the time of his conviction. He was sentenced to life in prison on account of his age, as I stated before. Eventually, he served his sentence until 1962 when he was paroled, and he did die in 2012 at the age of 78. So he was the only member of the Groveland Four who actually survived past the year 1969.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
Before we get into the exoneration, I do want to point out, as any good English teacher would, that there is a variety of reading that you can do on this subject. Of course, we will always put our source information into our show notes. There are 2 excellent books that have been written about this case, one of which did win the Pulitzer Prize. So for more information on this case, you can read 2004's Legal Lynching, The Sad Saga of the Groveland Four by George Corsair. And you can read 2012's Devil in the Grove, Thurgood Marshall, The Groveland Boys, and the Dawn of a New America by Gilbert King. And that did win the Pulitzer Prize. I wanted to make sure that I shared a quote from Gilbert King, author of Devil in the Grove. He sums up what I think is probably evident to everyone at this point. He says, quote, "It was one of the most corrupt and crooked trials that I think even the state attorney had ever seen before. Prosecutorial misconduct, perjury, manufacturing of evidence. But it didn't matter. It's the Jim Crow South," unquote.
It's just shocking. And the fact that this crooked sheriff and his cronies were willing to go to any length, up to and including murder, to cover up their malfeasance. It's just an absolutely horrible and shocking case. It reminds me of Mississippi Burning and other cases from the 60s, but this is all the way back into an absolutely horrible, dark time in America.
Now, Mr. King also stated in his book that the FBI conducted a very large-scale civil rights investigation. Unfortunately, the results of that investigation were sealed for more than 60 years. Not entirely sure what that's about. So what the FBI had learned about this case was not ever evident to Thurgood Marshall, for example, who worked on the case. It has only become evident recently what was found. According to the New York Times, they found a number of really interesting things when they looked at the unredacted FBI documents. So let me go ahead and just read straight out here from the New York Times reporting. Quote, unredacted FBI documents retrieved through a Freedom of Information request indicated that officials involved in the case admitted to beating the men and that evidence had been manufactured. Bill Gladson, state attorney, said that James Yates, a deputy who served as a primary witness, likely fabricated evidence, including shoe casts.
It's just horrifying. And there's no adequate explanation as to why the FBI knew this information and kept it sealed for 60 years.
It's just awful. And imagine being the families of these men who have had to fight for years to try to clear their loved ones' names and not being able to. But that does lead us to the good part of the case, which is an exoneration. When I was sitting down to do some research for this, I realized that I needed to bone up on my legal terminology because I was having problem with the difference between a pardon and an exoneration. So I did what everyone does who needs to look something up, and I went to Google. And I learned...
Wait a minute. Aren't you always telling your students not to do that?
No, I'm telling them not to go to Wikipedia.
Ah, okay. There is a difference.
They can Google.
Okay.
They can Google. There is some redeeming value to Google.
I use the Google machine every day.
As do I. Probably maybe more than I should, but still. So I did have to do a little bit of boning up on my legal terminology here. So for the purposes of our listeners who may need the same sort of knowledge one-up as I do, let me go ahead and give you the difference between a pardon and an exoneration. A pardon is, I'm going to quote right here from the definition that I got from the National Pardon Board, believe it or not. Quote, a pardon is a method through which an executive authority legally forgives someone for a crime and reinstates the rights lost post-conviction. Pardons are different than exonerations. They are not an acknowledgement of wrongful conviction. It is just a restoration of the civil status the person had prior to being convicted. So a pardon is like, it's a step down from an exoneration. It's okay, we're going to get to exoneration eventually, hopefully, but a pardon it's pretty okay. It's restoring your rights, essentially.
You used Richard Nixon as an example. Can you explain?
Yeah. So we know that Richard Nixon was pardoned, but we also know that he still committed a crime. A pardon does not mean that a crime was not committed. It just means that the person who committed the crime was forgiven for it, essentially. That's the way that I could put it to myself so that I would understand it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And exoneration is really much more, there's kind of an apology built in, is there not?
Yes. So again, here's the definition of exoneration, and this is from the National Registry of Exonerations. Exoneration. A person has been exonerated if he or she was convicted of a crime and, following a post-conviction re-examination of the evidence in the case, was either declared to be factually innocent by a government official or agency, or relieved of all the consequences of the criminal conviction by a government official or body with the authority to take the action.
Lots of people who are guilty of crimes are pardoned for a variety of reasons.
Like Richard Nixon.
But an exoneration is a real cleansing of your record and saying, we got this wrong, we the prosecutors. You are no longer seen as guilty of anything. In other words, you are innocent of the charges that were brought against you.
Yes, the record is clean. So Charles Greenlee's family had been seeking for a long time to have his name exonerated. And his daughter, Carol, who is 72, she's actually as old as the case is, has been seeking to have her father exonerated from, she said, from the day that she turned 40. She worked toward making sure that her father's name would be exonerated. She had asked him a number of times while he was still alive, do you want me to do this work? I will try to get you exonerated. And he discouraged her from it. I'm wondering if maybe that was a result of thinking that it would be too painful if it didn't happen. I don't think we can know one way or the other, but she did say that while he was still alive, he did discourage her from actively pursuing an exoneration, but she wanted to. And I think the best quote that I saw from her is she said, quote, "All my life, I've been waiting to hear those words, restore presumption of innocence." And so that did actually happen. It took a little bit of doing, though. It took a number of different steps. So it started in April of 2017. The state of Florida actually formally apologized to the families of the Groveland Four. They basically said, "We are sorry. That wasn't quite enough. It shouldn't have been enough." And so in December of 2018, the Department of Law Enforcement was ordered to review the case. After that review took place, the four men were formally pardoned by Governor Ron DeSantis in January of 2019. So we're one step closer. And then finally, in October of 2021, State Attorney Bill Gladson moved to have the men fully exonerated. And so once the evidence was presented, the men were fully cleared and exonerated in November. What that entailed was the charges against Thomas and Shepard, who were being retried for their crimes at the time of their death. Those charges were posthumously dismissed. So they have no record and the charges against them were dropped. The convictions for Greenlee and Irvin were vacated. I had to look up what that meant too, just to make sure I got it right. When you vacate a conviction, it means to dismiss it and act as if it never happened in the first place.
That's a real cleansing of one's record, whether you were dead before your trial or lived through your trial. And of course, all four of these gentlemen are gone. But this is really clearing their names.
Yes. I'm going to quote again from the New York Times here. Ms. Greenlee, 72, said the court's ruling was the end of feeling that nobody is listening, that you're inside a prison of your own, that you need to break out, but you don't know how because all the doors are locked.
Very powerful. Among the many people that worked on this case, there's a Florida state senator, Geraldine Thompson, who worked for years to help the men and their families clear their names posthumously. And although she left the Florida State Senate in 2016, when the book came out in 2012, Devil in the Grove, Thurgood Marshall, the Groveland Boys, and the Dawn of a New America by Gilbert King that Kristin had mentioned, she actually got 40 copies of the book and passed them out to her colleagues in the Florida State Senate as part of her effort to educate all of her colleagues as to the need to take steps to clear their record.
One of the nephews of Mr. Thomas, Aaron Newsom, is quoted as saying, "We are blessed. We hope the ruling will prompt prosecutors to reopen other flawed cases from the Jim Crow era." I hope that this is a start because lots of people didn't get this opportunity. Lots of families don't get this opportunity. Maybe now they will.
I'm amazed at how gracious Mr. Newsom is all these years later. It reminded me of when we were talking about Anthony Broadwater and the Elisa Bold case. I think I'd be carrying around such a reservoir of anger and resentment, and yet here it is all these years later, and their family members are actually able to accept this apology and pardon followed by an exoneration with such grace. I'm not sure I could get there.
I don't think I could.
But I don't think I could. I find it very impressive.
It very much is. There is now a memorial to the Groveland Four, and the families were there for the opening of that memorial last year as well. I'm glad that the time is being taken to set the record straight, but man, I can't believe it took this long.
I think there's an institutional resistance, which we've seen in the Colonial Parkway murders case and many others. There just seems to be this powerful institutional resistance to setting the record straight, much in the same way we have to keep pushing the FBI and the Virginia State Police to put resources into the Colonial Parkway murders and other cases. Setting the record straight doesn't seem to be a priority for a lot of law enforcement and prosecutorial institutions.
You would think that they would want to. State Attorney Bill Gladson really took a big step forward in bringing forth the concept of exoneration. And he wrote in his motion to the court, quote, "No fair-minded prosecutor would even consider filing the charges, and the evidence strongly suggests that the sheriff, the judge, and the prosecutor all but ensured guilty verdicts in this case. Quote, these officials, disguised as keepers of the peace and masquerading as ministers of justice, disregarded their oaths and set in motion a series of events that forever destroyed these men, their families, and a community. I have not witnessed a more complete breakdown of the criminal justice system, nor do I ever expect I will again."
It's hard not to read Gladson's comments and think to yourself, you know something, the people that belonged in jail were the sheriff, the judge, and the prosecutor. This is beyond the beyond. They've conspired against these four men in the so-called Groveland Four and railroaded these men, resulting in the deaths of two of them, and then two of them serving lengthy prison sentences, which they did not deserve. The criminals in this story are actually the sheriff, the judge, and the prosecutor.
Gladson pointed out that as he was doing research for this case, prosecutor Jesse Hunter's grandson stepped forward and said that he had found letters in his grandfather's possession stating that neither his grandfather, Jesse Hunter, nor the trial judge actually believed that Norma Paget had been raped. And yet they moved forward with it.
Unbelievable.
Really unbelievable. And I think, too, we can't leave out of the people who are responsible for this, the sheriff's deputy named James Yates, who produced exhibits for the trial. And in several cases, he fabricated evidence entirely or tampered with others.
Another person that should have served the rest of his life in jail. It's disgusting.
Absolutely.
It's worth noting, by the way, that the doctor that you mentioned at the top of this story, who offered his professional opinion that Norma Paget may not have even been raped and that there was no evidence to support their charges, was not permitted to testify at trial. Yeah. So if you were on board with this conspiracy to basically hang these four young men, you were permitted to participate. But if you had any evidence that didn't fit their narrative, they didn't even call you as a witness.
It's just awful. Now, I was very surprised in doing my research to learn that the woman behind this whole thing, Norma Paget, is still alive. So I believe you said, Bill, when you did some math earlier, Norma Paget would be 79?
I believe so. And she is still alive.
She has gone on the record as saying she does not want the men pardoned. Her quote on the whole thing was, "I am not no liar. I'm begging y'all not to give them pardon because they done it."
It's hard to not respond. I'm trying to offer a thoughtful response. It's possible that Ms. Paget was raped.
Yes.
The only strong conclusion we can draw, however, is that she was not raped by these four young men, Ernest Thomas, Samuel Shepard, Charles Greenlee, and Walter Irvin. She may have been sexually assaulted. She may have been sexually assaulted by her estranged husband at age 17, which I find kind of bizarre in and of itself. Or she may have been raped by others, but it's very clear she wasn't raped by any of these four gentlemen, two of whom were nowhere near where the crime was alleged to have occurred.
You know, and as I'm looking more into these exonerations, especially older cases, I'm finding a lot of these people were nowhere near here. How did they even get involved with this? It is making me very aware of how deeply unjust and broken the system can be, especially when it comes to Black men. And it is deeply unsettling and upsetting to learn these things. And I realize that is coming from a place of privilege of me as a white woman of a certain age to be able to say, I'm only just now learning this and understanding this. It is awful. There is so much more really good information on this case out there. We would definitely urge you to check out any and all of the reporting that has been done on this case. We will put our sources in our show notes. And of course, as we mentioned, there are 2 books on the subject: Legal Lynching, The Saga of the Groveland Four by George Corsair, and Devil in the Grove, Thurgood Marshall, The Groveland Boys, and The Dawn of a New America by Gilbert King. We hope you will stay tuned and listen to our episode next week where we cover another historical exoneration. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.